Oh, hello, mortal fleshling. Welcome to the Library of Grimwick, where we collect all of Master Grimwick's tales and accomplishments. The librarian told me that you would be here to get a synopsis of Grimwick's second volume from his time as a cat. Luckily for you, we've got it. Currently, we are calling this edition of the Crypts. Before I begin my beautiful rendition of Book 2, The Crypts, you should know that this is a summary. If you wish to relive each chapter individually, stop this recording now and go find those chapters. Or stick around if you'd like a refresher. Don't care about spoilers, or simply hear from my performance. We'll be covering chapters 7 through 13 in this collection. Now off to chapter 7. Chapter 7. A new assignment. If you recall, when we last saw Grimwick and Norbert, they were fighting for their lives against a large, abominable wolf. They survived, but barely. After their harrowing encounter, Grimwick and Norbert returned to Vine's office. Within moments of walking in the door, Grimwick insinuated that it was Vine who sent the wolf in the woods to kill them. Vine seemed more perturbed that Grimwick was standing on her desk than his recount of his near-death experience. She dismissed his accusations and proceeded to count the mushrooms they brought for her. And though Grimwick hated to admit it, the counting of mushrooms was important. For you see, Norbert was serving a semester-long detention for summoning a demon into his world. Vine's intentions were clear. Make Norbert's nights as long and tiring as possible, for Norbert, who was already a poor student, would perform even poorer in his classes. Once his grades had fallen across the board, she could expel him. Once expelled, Norbert would no longer be a student. She could inflict whatever pain she wanted, then including killing Grimwick in punishing Norbert in any way she saw fit. Her first task for them was to gather a rare type of mushroom that only appeared on nights when the moon was full. It was one of those nights, and Grimwick and Norbert had great luck grabbing more than Vine had required of them. But some of the mushrooms spilled over the edge when they were fighting off the wolf, and they weren't sure how many they had left. Making matters worse, Vine had a convoluted method of setting the count that they required. Their ever-increasing tally was up to 27 mushrooms that evening, and Vine was determined that they would not get there. She issued them partial credit for smaller-sized mushrooms. She counted and recounted 5 times, eventually settled that they had 27.5 mushrooms, marking this assignment complete. There was a moment of rejoice from both Norbert and Grimwick. Grimwick was glad that he didn't have to get dirty wandering around the woods, and Norbert was glad that he had no longer had to be graded at a master mage's level. But that moment was short-lived. Vine dashed all the good feelings by reminding them that they still had a semester's worth of detention left, and that the next assignment would begin the following night. When that following night came, she ushered them past the farthest reaches of the hallways down an unlit corridor. She led them into the cragstone crypts. It wasn't off limits for students, but no one dared tread in the shadows. The air was stale, it was impossible to see, and it made Grimwick's hairs stand up. After they walked down the twisting and winding paths, Vine stopped in what seemed like a library. She explained that this was the archive of the Crystal Era, a time period where advancement in magic also led to advancement in magical warfare. The tomes and books were preserved with magic, but they were dust-covered. Since the outside world seemed too dangerous for Norbert and his cat, Vine figured making his next assignment deep indoors would make him feel more comfortable. His next assignment was to clean every book, tome, table, and object in the entire archive. Norbert felt confident he could handle the dark dungeon in a few days as he cleaned some shelves, but his confidence faded when Vine illuminated the entire archive, revealing it was not just a few shelves, but hundreds of shelves. Nights passed, and while Norbert cleaned the shelves, Grimwick kept to his promise of helping Norbert finish the semester. If he did that, Norbert agreed to transfer his seal to another mage, so Grimwick would have a new host, something Grimwick was keen on, as he determined that Norbert was the weakest mage in the entire academy. Literally, anyone would be better than Norbert. So as Norbert cleaned, Grimwick would read the textbooks out loud to help Norbert study. It helped very little, but at least Grimwick kept up his side of the pact. The crypts were no less creepy in the subsequent nights, but the pair was beginning to get used to it. Most of the sounds they learned were from rats scurrying about, ghosts moaning, and old doors creaking. But there was a shuffle of change that they had heard every so often that they had no idea of what it could be. One of Grimwick's favorite games was to make up stories of what it could be. To his delight, this terrified Norbert. But one night they got to see for themselves what it really was. The sound shuffled into view to reveal a corpse of a woman, stringy hair, tattered robes, and rotten teeth. She shuffled towards them. Norbert stood petrified in fear, forcing Grimwick to a flurry of motions. Grimwick hurled everything he could at the creature, but the objects he could throw were too small due to his tiny cat paws. When Norbert came out of his fear, he heaved large tomes at the monster. Most were completely off target, but eventually one of the large tomes connected with the creature. The shock of the impact startled the creature enough, and it ran away back down the corridor. Grimwick and Norbert had no idea what they just saw, but before they could clean up their mess, Vine had returned, and she was not pleased. Chapter 8. Boiling Screams. As you might suspect, Vine was not too pleased to find the tomes and the books that Norbert was in charge of protecting and cleaning scattered about the floor. Grimwick and Norbert tried to explain what the monster that they saw, but Vine dismissed him, saying that it was merely a ghost. For their blatant disregard of the school's history, she issued Norbert a second strike. One more and he would be expelled, even without failing grades. When they tried to protest, she silenced them by saying that they were lucky that none of the books were damaged, or she would have given Norbert his third strike right then and there. So the two followed her back to the main building and up to their dormitories. As Norbert cried himself to sleep, Grimwick could only think that Vine had something to do with the appearance of a second monster. As they walked to Cauldron Basics the following morning, a student stopped Norbert in the hallway. Penelope Crest was one of the top students among Norbert's class. She had blue hair that was tied up in two large pigtails. She was popular amongst the students and always had a gaggle of students around her. She was even dating the top boy and Norbert's tormentor, Arthur Bogg. But no gaggle was around her today, and she seemed embarrassed to talk to Norbert. She would go on to apologize to Norbert for Arthur's behavior. She believed that Norbert was serving detention with Vine because Arthur had smashed cake on Norbert's face in front of the entire school. She had no idea it was because Norbert summoned a demon from another realm. Norbert was too stunned that someone actually talked to him to say anything, and he never corrected her. Relieved at getting the guilt off her chest, Penelope strode away to the next class. Cauldron Basics was technically Norbert's best class. Professor Crinkle taught her she had a soft spot for Norbert, often bumping up his grades, sharing recipes with him, or sneaking him extra desserts to the side. But she knew that Norbert was accident-prone, and since today there was an open fire in the classroom, students had to work in pairs. Professor Crinkle randomly assigned the pairings. Norbert was paired up with Penelope, another student who went by Red. From what Grimwick had gathered, Red was as unambitious as Norbert. She was always staring off into space or doodling. She never seemed to be studying, but then again it was hard to see what she was looking at, as she had long crimson-colored bangs that hung over her eyes like curtains. Despite Cauldron Basics being Norbert's best class and taught by his favorite teacher, he was too tired from the previous night, and just as class began, Norbert fell asleep. Fred got busy and started to draw over the sleeping Norbert's hand, while Penelope was the only one at their station actually doing work. Grimwick took the opportunity to make a recipe of his own in the oven in the back. He was going to make ghost fire chili. It was an advanced recipe that he read on the back of Norbert's textbook, and it was said that it would be so potent that even zombies could smell it. Grimwick's idea was to keep some in case that monster showed back up again, or at least prank Norbert with it. But before Grimwick could pull the chili out of the oven, Red was transfixed by Grimwick, and because Red didn't know Grimwick's true nature, he was forced to remain in his cat act, another one of Vine's annoying spells. Slowly the fire in the oven grew and grew, until finally the oven burst open, spilling spicy orange gas into the air. Students were crying and throwing up. The gas spread down the hallways. Classrooms evacuated and the crowd had formed. After spells were cast and foul language was said, the cloud dissipated, revealing Professor Crinkle to be covered in an orange goo, and Norbert and Grimwick at the center of the destruction. The first one to clear the line was, of course, none other than Vine. She smiled. Creating a gas and unleashing onto fellow students was certainly worthy of a third strike. But just before she could officially assign the strike and whisk Norbert and Grimwick away, Penelope stepped out of the crowd. She said it was her fault. Vine, Grimwick, and Norbert were shocked. When Vine pressed Penelope why she did it, she said that she wanted to try an advanced recipe. She didn't know it would go wrong. But then Red stepped forward and claimed that she had added some extra ingredients for a little excitement. She didn't mean for it to go wrong. These, of course, were lies. We still aren't sure why Penelope and Red took the blame. We think from guilt, or just pity, or some interest in seeing what Vine's detentions were really like. Vine stared at Grimwick. She could probably tell that it wasn't these two students' fault, but it was Grimwick's. Yet after she made sure Penelope and Red knew that their punishments would be severe, neither student backed down. Vine issued them each a strike and assigned them to join Norbert's detention for the next 2 weeks. She then dismissed the crowd and left the students and the cat alone. Chapter 9. A Bump in the Night. Penelope and Red joined Norbert and Grimwick in the Crypts. Vine walked them down the dark tunnels to the Crystal Era archive. She informed Penelope and Red that they were responsible for cleaning 2 full bookcases, or that they will be down there for 2 weeks, whichever came first. Penelope realized that while they had to clean 2 large cases, Norbert had to clean hundreds of them, all by himself. She also believed that Norbert is here because of her boyfriend Arthur Bogg continued to tease Norbert, and it was Norbert who got blamed for all these scuffles while Arthur got to go off with so much as a warning. She swallowed her nerve and addressed Vine about it. She told Vine how unfair it was that Norbert was always the one getting into trouble, that the incident in the cafeteria a few weeks ago was Arthur's fault. Norbert didn't even fight back. Arthur was the bully and he should be down here, not Norbert. This amused Vine, and that smirk that she seldom shared was back on her face. She was amused that Penelope volunteered for this detention out of a misplaced guilt. So she delighted in telling Penelope that Norbert wasn't down here because it was Arthur or the other students picked on him. She even thought that some inter-class competition was good. She didn't even care if students used magic. They are mages after all. Vine also took the opportunity to point out that Penelope enables Arthur's behavior, but that mattered not for right now. For what Norbert was down here was for something far worse than squabbling. But her and Norbert made a bit of a deal. As long as he didn't say what he did, he would serve detention for the rest of the semester. But she added a semester detention was far too light of a punishment. Penelope's demeanor changed from one of nervousness to bottled anger. Vine left them alone, reminding Norbert that not to reveal their little secret. A secret that would be much harder to keep now that Penelope and Red knew that there was something more to Norbert's sentence. Penelope yelled at Norbert while Red peppered him with questions. In all of their commotion, a moan came from the tunnels that silenced the group. The sound of chains rustled and that monster came back. This time she was more complete, more full of features, but still a very evil glow about her eyes. Students were paralyzed by a spell of some sort, so Grimwick leapt into action yet again, throwing books and objects at the creature. When that failed, he leapt on top of the creature and tried to claw at the creature's face, but the monster's face began to heal. Eventually the creature managed to throw Grimwick. Grimwick teleported back into Norbert's gut, breaking him of his trance. Norbert then began to throw larger tomes and books at the creatures, but did not have the same effect as before. The creature was stronger now. It continued to advance. Grimwick tried to create a fireball. The monster was almost on them now. Norbert let out a scream. A small white flame appeared in Grimwick's hand, and then that white spark erupted into a burst, just like water breaking from a dam. White flame splashed around the room, igniting the shelves, the books, and eventually the creature. The creature began to melt. In a panic, it rolled on the floor and managed to extinguish its flames before running down the hallway screaming. When Grimwick turned around, he found Red's eyes bulging from her bangs in amazement. Grimwick's cover was blown. Grimwick knew that Vine wasn't going to like that. Norbert was staring in horror at the damage they had caused. Books, shelves, and tomes lie in ash. Norbert knew Vine wasn't going to like that, and Penelope quivered as Vine appeared in the doorway. She did not, in fact, like it any of it. Chapter 10. The Undead Arts. At the sight of all the destruction, Vine lost her cool demeanor. Priceless and historical tomes and scrolls lay in ashes, and the demon cat was now on his hind legs and speaking, which means that Penelope and Red now know that Grimwick is no normal cat. To what extent of his summoning, she did not know. Regardless, they knew enough to break her spell. So now Grimwick was standing on his hind legs and speaking so they all could understand. Grimwick declared that the monster has come back even stronger and insinuated that it was Vine's doing, just like the wolf from a few nights ago. Vine was tired of Grimwick's accusations and cast him in a soundproof bubble. Norbert too tried to explain, but broke down in tears. Vine placed him too in the bubble, not wanting to hear his sobs. Penelope and Red echoed that it had been a monster of some sort. Had it not been for Red and Penelope's explanations, Vine probably would have expelled Norbert right then and there, but instead she conceded that she'd look further into the monster the following night. If she found no traces of the monster, Norbert would be given his third strike and would be expelled from Cragstone, and Penelope and Red would be given a second strike and serve out the remainder of their semester in detention in Norbert's place. She heard no further protests and ushered them all back to their dorms. Back in his room, Norbert just moped while Grimwick tried to formulate a plan. Grimwick's theory was that Vine had planned this all along, that the wolf and this monster were her doing. Tomorrow evening she would claim that she didn't find anything, and they would be expelled. She would kill Grimwick and send Norbert packing to whatever corner of the realm he came from. It looked like she would get away with this, for the faculty did not care about Norbert, and none would stick up for him. The only one that would remotely even like Norbert was Crinkle, but after Grimwick destroyed her classroom, she was no longer an option. Their only plan now was to escape the island while Vine was down in the crypts the following night. It would only be for a small window. The only thing that they could do now was get some sleep, but they both struggled with that. Norbert was restless, crying that he'd be on the run forever and never be able to sleep in a bed again. And if he was caught, and Vine didn't kill him, his grandmother sure would. Grimwick too struggled to sleep, for Vine seemed to be telling the truth that she killed demons and other monsters in her life. He feared what she would do to him before sending him back to Hellforge. The next day came, and Grimwick and Norbert shuffled into the table in the back of necromancy class. In some kingdoms had been renamed to the Undead Arts. It was taught by Professor Nickel, who came from a famous mage family who specialized in the undead arts, but he was squeamish about the subject. Normally this amused Grimwick, but not today. He wasn't in the mood. Before class began, Penelope and Red slid into the bench next to Norbert. They were ecstatic. They had been up all night formulating a plan. They were going to get Nickel off topic to see if they could learn what kind of creature they encountered last night. Though Vine prohibited them from speaking to anyone about it, she did not prohibit them from gathering more information. Luckily for the students, it was a demonstration day, where they'd be performing magic on a dead rat, and Professor Nickel, being so squeamish, was happy to answer questions instead of doing a gross demonstration. So Penelope, Red, and even Norbert asked him some questions. They tried to gather clues about this realm's version of zombies, ghosts, wraiths, monster rodents, and liches. Professor Nickel was more than happy to elaborate on each. Each student thought of different ideas, but Grimwick suspected that the monster had to be some form of enhanced zombie, for the descriptions didn't match that of a ghost or mutant rodents. The more plausible was a wraith or a lich, but those were both myths. Urban legends, the amount of magical energy to create one would be immense and impossible to gather. When class ended, the students waited around to ask Nickel more questions, but before they could, Vine appeared. She made sure that their conversations with Nickel ended, and she had Nickel all to herself, which left the students frustrated and worried about whatever Vine was planning. Chapter 11. Into Darkness. The following night came, and Vine had sequestered Norbert, Penelope, Red, and Grimwick into a classroom. The classroom had hovering orbs of light and piles of parchment paper. She told the students that they were lucky that the archivist created audio orbs of the scrolls that they destroyed. They were to listen to the orbs and copy each word to the recording. While they did that, she was going to investigate the crypts with Professor Nickel to find their so-called monster. She waited for no questions, slammed the door shut, and locked the handle with a spell. When Nickel questioned her about locking the door, she informed her that she did not fear the students leaving, but this ghost or monster trying to get in. No monster could open this door now, and only a ghost could get through the door. If that was the case, it proved her point that these students were overreacting. The two professors walked into the dark tunnels. As Nickel asked questions about what they were looking for, Vine told them about the clues she'd already gathered, and that there does seem to be something to the students' tall tale. She did find a dead body of an enhanced wolf when Norbert said it would be. The students do seem to be afraid of something supernatural, and she found a torn burial shroud snagged on the torches in the tunnels below. But a few pieces of what they were dealing with was missing. And then Nickel realized what she was implying. He was the only undead arts instructor and the only one with necromancy experience on the island. She assumed that these monsters were her doing. Professor Nickel, who was so excited to work with the great Professor Vine, was crestfallen to learn that he was no more of a suspect to her. Back in the classroom, Norbert struggled to keep up with the audio orbs. Not helping matters was Grimwick barking out ideas as he was angrily pointing to the chalkboard where he drew an elaborate suspect chart of all their clues. Grimwick had determined that it was Vine. Everything led back to her. In fact, she was probably murdering Nickel right now. And then she could do whatever she wanted to Grimwick and Norbert. But Penelope refuted Grimwick. She said that the professors couldn't harm students, that they took an oath that was bound by magic. Vine could be as scary and as mean as she wanted, but she could only do so much. Penelope also reminded Norbert that they did the audio orb exercises in class already. By weaving a spell and waving the quill through the orb, the recordings could write themselves. Grimwick insisted that they forget about the orbs and leave immediately. Once Vine expelled them all, they wouldn't be students, and then she could do whatever she pleased to them. Yet all the students resolved to stay, even Norbert. But just as Grimwick reached for the door, the handle shook. Someone or something was trying to get in. Back in the crypts, Nickel pointed out that Vine was a selfish and self-righteous person. She had no right to accuse him. He told her that none of the faculty liked her. The students hated her. He always thought it was misplaced. But now he sees that it was all very well deserved. Vine cared for none of Nickel's prattlings, which he continued for quite some time until a moan bellowed from the dark tunnels. They both looked to see a glowing figure that the students had described at the end of the corridor. They ran after it, down one tunnel and down another. The creature seemed to be just out of reach at every turn. Finally, the tunnel opened up and they found themselves on the island's southern docks. They both studied their surroundings. The monster vanished. Just as they wondered why, it hit them. They were about as far away from the school as castles they could be. They ran back towards the school, ran through the woods, up the stairs, down the halls. When they got to the room they left the students in, they found the door was ajar. They burst into the room. Everything was mostly as they left it, but the students were missing. There was a sign of a struggle, but not from the students, but from the cat. The students seemed to have disappeared quietly, while the cat seemed to fight back. Claw marks on the desks and the furniture were their first clues. It was Nickel who found the reason why. A muffin was on the floor that had a large bite taken out of it, and it smelled like a sleeping agent had been placed inside. The students were gone. Someone had taken them, and Vine had an idea of who. Chapter 12. Supper of Students. Grimwick was the first to wake. He found himself tethered by rope to the other 3 students. The room that they were trapped in had high ceilings and impressive metal work that kept the cavern surrounding them from caving in. They must be deep within the crypts now. Quietly humming to herself was the culprit who brought them down here. Professor Crinkle. Grimwick yelled at her, and to his surprise, she answered, which means that she must have figured out that he was some form of summon for Norbert. But in her rambling, she thought it was Vine who gave Norbert the summon as a means to protect him. Before Grimwick could laugh at the notion at Vine being charitable, she informed him that they would die in this chamber. The monster would be back soon, and she always preferred the life force of students. That cheerful disposition that was always giving Norbert muffins and cookies and baked goods was now wicked and cold. Grimwick could feel the ropes moving. The others were waking up now. And Norbert must have heard his favorite teacher's words of how little she cared for him. But Norbert could cry and sort out his emotions later. Now they needed to escape. Penelope cut the ropes, and Grimwick, Penelope, and Red leapt into battle stances. Before they could react, Crinkle cast a spell that was like a smog of sleep. Penelope whipped up a wind barrier that kept the smog at bay. Grimwick and Red went on the offensive. Grimwick used her rock magic to fire Grimwick like a springboard. Grimwick flew with his claws outstretched. He held his breath as he flew through the dense smog, landing eventually on Crinkle's face. He wasted no time clawing at her and interrupting her spell. Grimwick worked as fast as he could until she snatched him by the neck, her eyes full of anger, which amused Grimwick to delight when he said, "What are you going to do, pumpkin butt?" She replied, "Oh, I'm not going to hurt the students, but I think I'll kill you." Before she could cast a spell, a gust of wind hit her, and a rock ledge tripped her as she toppled backwards. Penelope and Red smiled. Grimwick didn't wait for her to get up, and together they all ran towards the exit as fast as they could. And when they were almost to the door, the monster appeared in the exit. The monster was fuller now, almost human. Its toothless smile said, "Students." While Norbert cowered, Penelope sliced gusts of wind at the monster. Red pelted it with rocks, and Grimwick fired sparks, hoping to ignite her robes. None of their efforts made any effect on the monster. The barrage was more of an annoyance to the creature, and it only made it angry. The monster let out a scream, stilling the air, stopping the rocks, and extinguishing the sparks. The creature went into double speed, landing strikes on each of the students that sent them flying back towards the center of the room. The creature reached for Grimwick with a glowing green hand. Just before it reached him, he teleported back on top of Norbert. Thank goodness for that short tether. The creature now seemed amused. The students had all tried their best, but they were no match for whatever this creature was. This almost human monster reveled in their agony. It summoned a large spell that was in that same glow that he had reached out to Grimwick with. The air grew stale. This was something wicked. It smelled of death. Grimwick could only watch as the students struggled to get to their feet. He stood in front of them. He wasn't trying to defend them, but if Norbert died, he got sent back to Hellforge, and he waited too long of an opportunity to conquer a realm. He wasn't going back empty-handed. He stood trying to channel fire or some kind of energy. The monster fired her spell. No magic or spell came out of Grimwick, but he could feel that power that he'd felt when he generated the white flame in the archive, but it was more distant. When the monster's blast was on them, a force of white light washed over the students and Grimwick, redirecting that evil energy around them. When Grimwick turned to see, it was Norbert. His eyes glowed white-hot, his hands illuminated, his robes tearing. Then the attack was over, and Norbert's eyes returned back to their normal shade. Exhausted, he collapsed to the floor. The monster seemed as surprised as Grimwick, Penelope, and Red. Even Norbert seemed unsure of where that energy came from, but then tears began to fall on his face. He apologized to all of them. He apologized to Red and Penelope that they were here because of him. He apologized to Grimwick that he couldn't help him more. He started rambling about his other regrets. Grimwick told him to shut up. Just make another force field. The monster was charging another attack now. Norbert shuffled on his knees in front of Penelope, Red, and Grimwick. He strained to just stay awake. All he could do now was block the monster's next spell with his body. There was no time for protest. The monster's spell was on them now. Grimwick closed his eyes. Then the ground shook, and the blackness went away. Grimwick peered around Norbert. Professor Vine was standing between them and the monster. Magical smoke swirled about her hand. Students began to cry with joy. Grimwick, too, recalls it the first time he was actually glad to see Vine. Chapter 13. Showdown. Vine stood there, unafraid of this monster. In fact, she seemed excited. Seeing the monster this close solved the mystery of all of it for her. This was no traditional monster, but certainly a monster nonetheless. This was the infamous headmistress of Cragstone during the Crystal Era, an era that the island was a military school. The headmistress was rumored to have students compete against each other in elaborate tournaments. The loser, and sometimes even the winners, would be taken away for private instruction. In most cases, those mages were never heard from again, as she would have devoured their life force. Seeing this monster made Vine smile, that if anyone could return from the dead in the form of a lich, it would have to be her. And seeing Crinkle in the foreground proved that it must have been Crinkle gathering the ingredients for her return. That was probably where the piglets in the forest and the rats from the crypt all went. It was as if Vine was meeting her hero. The monster fired a spell. Vine deflected it and returned it with another spell. The monster wasn't expecting that. Grimwick was in awe on watching the two fight. Then the sniffling Professor Nichols showed up, grabbing the students and making them move towards the exit. But the monster had another idea. She cast a ring of fire that kept them trapped, but the creature couldn't keep focus on the fire with the attacks from Vine. Eventually, the desperate creature got behind Crinkle. One would think it was looking for cover, but the headmistress had other ideas. She reached with her cursed hand towards Crinkle, and Crinkle let out a scream as her own life force was being drained. Vine fired a blast, but it was too late. But when the dust settled, the monster was now almost human. Her hair stood out in every direction, her teeth less rotten. Her broken speech was full and cohesive. Vine fired another shot, but in this state the monster no longer flinched. "My, this world has become weak," she said. "I think I'm going to enjoy this." Vine and the headmistress went into another round of combat. Grimwick could barely follow their movements now. Spells and attacks whiplashed around. The students and Grimwick and Nickel huddled closer together. Nickel erupted a bone cage of rocks and cast a magical shield over it to keep them safe from the debris. Eventually the sounds of fighting stopped, and the broken body of Vine hit the top of the shield. Her tidy hat was missing, her robes torn, she was bleeding, and her limbs were limp. Norbert yelled to lower the shield, but Vine shook her head and just mouthed the words, "Run," before she was swallowed back into the dust. Grimwick yelled now, "Norbert's right, lower the shield. I don't like her either, but she's our only way out of here." When the dust settled, the monster held Vine by her neck. Vine's arms were broken or too tired to move. Vine and the headmistress were cast in that emerald green light, but the monster was straining to drain Vine's energy. Even with her body broken, she was as stubborn as ever. Nickel did lower the shield and looked toward the students and the cat. "I'll distract her. You make a run for it." Which was easier said than done. Though Nickel was noble, he was no match for the creature, and he knew it. Still, he tried and fired a spell. The headmistress caught it and fired it back at 10 times stronger than how he'd first sent it. It connected with him in an explosion that sent him flying over the students. The headmistress dropped Vine and said, "I think I'll snack on your students and come back for you." Grimwick was the only one standing now. The students all seemed too hurt. "Mophead, launch me!" Grimwick yelled. Red didn't wait, and with the little strength that she had left, she launched Grimwick with that same spring door again. Grimwick flew through the air with his claws outstretched. The headmistress smiled. "This trick again." Grimwick could barely see it. She fired a small red orb that connected with his face. He wasn't sure when he teleported with Norbert's tail. He could just feel his skull cracking and his head caving in. The next thing he remembers is the headmistress standing over him. He could feel his jaw snapping back into place. She extended her glowing hand towards the students. Grimwick looked towards Vine. She was broken, but still looking at them. Grimwick yelled, "Do something, Vine. Aren't you supposed to be some great monster hunter and demon killer? Well, do it! I know you've got some powerful energy stored in you. Use it!" Vine didn't stir at all, so Grimwick did the only thing that he could think of. He leapt up and sunk his teeth into the headmistress's rotten hand. Vine would only admit it later, but Grimwick's actions and words stirred something in her. She did have a hidden reserve of power, an evil curse. She feared to use it. Even dying would be better than using it now, but the feeling of losing or seeing her students die in front of her seemed far worse. She took her unbroken arm and unlocked the runes that kept that power in place. Soon her body was popping itself back together. Her hair became charged, her eyes pitch black. Dark energy swirled around her like an octopus on fire. This got the attention of the headmistress, who turned to face Vine. In a quick move, Vine hit the headmistress, sending her flying. Vine once again stood between the monster and her students. She looked at Norbert. "Mr. Soot, grab Professor Nickel and bring him here. You all need to stay together and make a shield." As Norbert scurried to grab the injured Nickel, Grimwick watched as Vine was gaining the upper hand in the fight. She was able to move at an insanely fast pace, keeping up with his headmistress. He sensed that something dark and powerful stirred inside of Vine. It was like the headmistress's energy, but something different, something older, something even more foul. But Vine's tactics were mostly defensive, keeping the headmistress away from the students and away from the Lich's energy source. The monster was growing weaker and weaker while Vine was remaining in control. Grimwick could see it. The monster was getting desperate. In a last-ditch effort, the headmistress generated a strong spell, so strong that Vine's only counter to the attack was with an equally powerful spell. The two were in a stalemate, their spell swirling into a powerful orb. The orb was growing larger and more concentrated. It was a gambit. The headmistress and Vine would no longer be able to play defense. They needed to put all of their energy into this attack. Vine was yelling for Norbert to make a shield. Norbert waved his hands frantically with no luck. Grimwick got low to the ground. The monster's energy was fading and growing weaker. In the end, the headmistress couldn't hold back Vine's power. The energy orb wrapped her in a blood-chilling scream. The following eruption of power shook the whole chamber. Dust, debris, and winds rushed about. When it all settled, Grimwick could hear Nickel and the other students moaning, which meant that they would live for another day. Torches and fires had all been extinguished and the ground glowed like soft-lit charcoals. Vine collapsed to the floor and resealed her runes. She returned to her normal shade but lay broken on the ground. All was almost calm. Then a husk came from the dust, shuffled towards Vine with a drawn knife. Grimwick put his hands together and sent out a tiny orb of power. When it made contact with the husk, it exploded into dust. The knife sunk into the ground. Grimwick moved towards the knife and Norbert moved towards Vine. The knife was an unusual wavy pattern with an interesting design. Vine grabbed it before Grimwick could examine it closer. Despite her normal proud demeanor, she accepted Norbert's help to stand up. Vine informed the students that Penelope and Red would have all their strikes removed and their detention would be considered complete, and that Norbert would still have to serve detention until the end of the semester, but that she would remove his strikes as well. That was the biggest thanks that they were ever going to get from her. She gave a smirk to Grimwick and alluded that even the heartless demons seemed to be concerned for the group's well-being, to which Grimwick wanted to make everyone very clear that that was not the case. He just couldn't lose his host. He does need to conquer this realm after all, and he couldn't just let the blubbering idiot just die. Penelope and Red helped Nickel walk, and they all exited the chamber together. And as Norbert, Grimwick, Penelope, Red, Vine, and Nickel thought this day was one, far away, two figures who referred to Vine as her sister smiled as they looked into their orbs. Though their attempt to bring back the headmistress had failed, their long-lost sister seemed to be alive. Not only that, but she was hiding out on Cragstone Island. And there you have it. Grimwick and Norbert survived another monster attack, learned that Vine was hiding some secrets of her own, and maybe even gained a few new friends. In Book 3, Vine seems concerned that in peacetime, mages have grown weak. Though she wasn't crazy about how the headmistress conducted herself, she wanted to bring back the mage tournament, well, without killing the contestants part. Of course, the current head mage of Cragstone doesn't want to miss out a great opportunity to show off his school to the other kingdoms. How will the mages handle the tournament? Will Norbert even get in? We'll stick around. Book 3 will be on public display soon. And from everyone here at Grimwick's Library, thanks for listening, or whatever.